art and architecture. Now, the ancient Egyptians had many wonderful artifacts and monuments which they produced during all the time periods of ancient Egypt. However, sometimes they didn't believe that those objects should be considered art. A lot of times art historians might call objects art that the ancient Egyptians thought of as more for their symbolic or also functional purposes. So today, this evening, I'll try and take a look at a lot of those objects, the most popular over the time periods of ancient Egypt, and try and give just a brief overview of the most popular arts and artworks from those periods within the context of what the ancient Egyptians believed them to be about. So we'll go ahead and get started just by looking at a map here quickly. This is just a map of Egypt and some notable cities listed on here as well. Some of those we'll see along our way on the tour tonight. And I'll start off by talking actually about the pre-dynastic period, which is probably the earliest recorded period that we have in Egyptian art history. And from this period we see paintings represented by this painting which I have up here, a tomb painting. And a lot of times in these paintings they were mostly geometric. However, sometimes as we see in this painting up here, they also represented stick figures of human beings, and these were rather simplistic or stick-like. Also, sometimes they would represent animals on these paintings as well. And what's really interesting about the representation of animals is that a lot of times they were in different styles. So sometimes the painters would depict animals in different ways, so we can kind of get an idea that they were really trying to capture nature in new ways, so sort of experimenting with their paintings, much like artists still do today with all the different art styles that come up, even today. Also in the pre-dynastic period, besides paintings, we see stonework that really pops out of ancient Egyptian culture. For instance, in this case, we have the palette of King Narmer, which is one of those artifacts that sometimes would have more of a functional purpose. These sorts of palettes were often thought to be used to hold eye makeup or some sort of ritual makeup. In the center palette there, where the two animals are intertwined. However, this palette was probably more of a decorative or ritual purpose, just because it is so intricately carved. And on the left-hand side of this slide, we see King Narmer himself, and he's the largest figure on the palette because it is to represent him. And this whole palette is really designed to show his power as a ruler. And we see him actually vanquishing an enemy. King Narmer was a ruler of southern Egypt, and so here he's shown conquering his enemy, and this palette really just honors that victory. There's also a falcon in the upper right-hand corner of that left side image, and this falcon represents the god Horus, most likely, which was also sometimes seen to represent the pharaoh on earth. And so the pharaoh, or the falcon, is holding up a little papyrus reed, which symbolizes, again, Narmer's victory. Now on the bottom of the palette, we see two smaller crouching figures, which are thought to be enemies of King Narmer, and he stands over them symbolically, again, as a sign of his victory. On the other side of the palette, which is actually called the obverse, so in stonework, when there's two sides that are carved like this, the front side would be called the obverse, and then the back side would be called the reverse. So on the obverse side, we see another image of King Narmer in the top register, and I'll talk about registers too in just a moment. But we see Narmer up there, and he's again the largest figure on the whole palette itself. And that's another important element that was really introduced in this pre-dynastic period, which shows the ruler, whoever was being honored on the stonework, as the largest figure, and then all the other figures, especially his enemies, are all smaller than him on the palette. Now on the upper right-hand corner of that obverse side of the palette, we see two rows of individuals who are again believed to be Narmer's enemies with their heads removed. So that's another symbol of his power over there. Also on the bottom, there's a bull that seems to be smashing into a city, which again just symbolizes, the bull is supposed to symbolize King Narmer. And the city is also seen from an aerial view, just like those enemies up there are seen from as well. Now the registers that I mentioned quickly, that's a really important element of Egyptian style that developed in this period, because beforehand with the painting that we saw earlier, the elements were kind of not really organized in the painting. They were more just arranged sort of haphazardly on the painting. But in this case, we see everything is very orderly and organized by those registers, which are horizontal rows on there. And so that's one way that the Egyptians had of creating order, because in their time, they really believed in creating order, in the concept of order and balance in their kingdom. And so here, they use those registers as just one more way of adding order to the universe. Now, another example of stonework from the pre-dynastic period is actually a mace head. And mace heads, we can see actually on the palette of King Narmer, he holds up a mace head. These were typically used as weapons. However, this decorative mace head that we see was probably more of a ritual object, maybe used in some sort of ritual by the ruler. And this fragment that we can tell from over here seems to honor a ruler called the Scorpion King. So he shows the king, and again, he is the largest figure on the palette because it is meant to honor him. And we see some other examples of papyrus, again to symbolize the king's victory. The king was also a southern ruler, and this fragment actually honors the overseeing of a canal that the king oversaw. So that's just another example of, in the pre-dynastic period, how a lot of different important trends were developed in ancient Egypt. One last trend I'd like to talk about is actually the Egyptian canon, which you can see in especially the figure of the Scorpion King himself. And this was a way of portraying the body that was more of a composite representation of the body. So the torso would be frontal, so facing towards the viewer. Also, the person's eye would be facing the viewer. But then the rest of the person's body would be all in profile, so seen from the side. So his arms, legs, and even his head are facing profile. And that's something that we see in a lot of traditional Egyptian artwork. Now, moving on to the next main time period of ancient Egypt, we go to the Old Kingdom. And sculpture from the Old Kingdom, a lot of times was for royals. So they would have statues for these royal figures, and these statues were very idealized. We see here a picture of Menkaure, who was a ruler, along with his wife. And as you can see, they're facing very frontal. They appear very stiff and rigid, just facing out towards the audience. And this was the typical way that rulers were portrayed. The idea was that these figures were supposed to be homes for the Ka to come and relax in the afterlife. So sort of reliquary figures for the home, for the Ka. And so for that reason, they wanted to make these figures appear as eternal as possible so that they could last as long as the Ka would last, which would be hopefully for all eternity. Also, another traditional kind of pose that we see is with the hands clenched at the side, as we can see Menkaure has, and the legs stretched out in front of him is another thing that we'll see in a lot of these images of rulers. Now, for other folks that were portrayed, for instance, they have some depictions of children. We see right here King Pepi II with his mother. And Pepi II, even though he was probably a younger boy at this time, he looks just like a little version of an older pharaoh, so just like the little Menkaure over there. And he's shown in kind of an unusual pose because he's sitting on his mother's lap. But we still see those same elements that were used to depict royalty, with them both facing out frontal towards the audience. Now also, some other depictions, just besides royalty, we also have depictions of people who had other professions in ancient Egypt who weren't as high class, but still had very well-honored professions. For instance, here we see the scribe, the seated scribe. And scribes were very honored in ancient Egypt. Right here, he's holding a piece of paper and also a writing utensil just to signify his trade and profession. But he's represented in a different way that would